In this video, I'm going to wrap up the bench cabinet build, and I'm going to start by showing you how I made the base, which is really the structural foundation to almost all pieces you're going to do in woodworking. It's really important that it's strong and that it can hold up the weight of whatever is going to be going on or in the cabinet. So I'm going to start by cutting some large open joints in the legs I got, and in order to do that safely, I had to make a jig. I kind of just was using scrap and threw this together. You can see it's a very tight cut on the saw, so I'm using double-sided tape to hold everything down so my fingers can stay away from the blade, make it a little bit safer. Basically, I built this as I went. I kind of had a rough plan to make a cradle that will hold the leg in place so I could slide it through my saw and cut those open dado joints. So as you can see, I was just using a scrap 2x4. It doesn't really matter the sizes of them. It's just making that angle accurate so that that leg can sit in the back. I can't remember the exact measurement. I put it on my bevel gauge and then transferred it to the saw, but it was about 12 degrees. So I also cut a piece of plywood at the same time, so you can see that plywood sits on the base of the saw as well. That's the back side of the cradle, and I could do the exact same thing for the front. It was a slightly different angle. I think this one was closer to 15 degrees, and brads are going to be enough to hold this all in place. I basically just need to make 4 cuts. So that is the front side, and then as well as the back side. Pretty simple so far. 2 pieces of ply, 2 slabs of 2x4. Now in order to keep this in place, front to back, I had the fence done. Now I need side to side. Same process. I just cut that 12-degree angle on a bunch of little scrap pieces of ply, and I could build up a dimension in order to keep that leg in place side to side as well as front to back. So that's all I'm doing, nestling it in there, hence why I'm calling it a cradle, and building up that dimension enough so that then that front piece could be attached as well. Making sure it's going to slide on the table saw, and that is what that front piece is going to look like. Everything nestled in place. It slides pretty well, and then obviously I was going to put something in the back to hold everything together, as well as have one solid dimension riding along the fence. Simple process, scrap piece of ply, just mocked it up in place, attached the 2 plywood pieces with some brads, and then I could slide it back and forth. And this is just going to hold everything in place as I send it through the saw. Because I have these nestled in place, I really only want to run it through that stack once, which means I'm going to be removing a lot of material at once. I don't want to raise and lower the blade each leg, which would take forever. So hence why it's kind of built like Fort Knox, but it holds everything in place. And then just for extra stability, I put a clamp once I pop the leg in there to hold everything together. So I have a 3/4 inch dado stack. I'm basically cutting an open-ended mortise, which will slide onto the legs, similar to a bridle joint. So you can see how that piece pops in and out of that jig. There's going to be a little bit of tear out doing this, but in general it actually looked pretty nice. This is a paint grade project, so nothing I'm super concerned about with those little bits of tear out. And making sure that it's cutting identical joints, everything's lining up nicely, and I cut all 4 legs that way. Then for the base, I'm going to be making this out of poplar because I'm using that for the face frame, so I could buy just a couple boards and get all of my material out of it. I went with a 2-inch wide piece for this because this is a bench. Someone is going to be sitting on this. And just to clean up the edges, I cut a little bit of an angle on the corners just to make it a little more aesthetically pleasing. And then I just go through and put a bunch of dado joints on there. I'll put slats between the dados, and then the legs sit on this, and it just makes for a really solid base. So you can see I'm just using a stop at the end of the saw so I can flip the board, both pieces, and get symmetrical cuts on either end and cut all those joints at one time just by moving that board. I only have to do it 3 times. I cut the center and then the 2 ends, could set this up on the piece. This customer wanted very specific requirements for the offset of the legs. Everything had to be exactly 2 inches, the legs from the front, sides, and the back. So you can see I have some rough pencil marks on the bottom, which you'll never see once it's painted. Can line it up with that and then cut my slats, which will go in the place of that base. So like I said, this is obviously a base for the piece of furniture I'm working on. The style that she wanted for this is very similar to mid-century modern, so the legs have that angle to them. For stuff like this, I bought these legs on Amazon. I think they were $23. It's cheaper than buying the wood and making them in the shop, and I could easily cut the angle on them and then pop them in place. And like I said, this sort of design with this base can be put on the bottom of really any sort of type of cabinetry based furniture. And then I could just go through and glue everything together using Titebond 3, which is kind of my glue of choice in the shop. Get everything set up. I'm going to glue it together on the bottom of the base because I know that that's flat. Add the legs, and like I said, nice solid little piece. Put clamps on in place, and since this is going to be screw attached, you could see how you could kind of modify and utilize this design for multiple styles of furniture. And then the next day I'm just going to attach it with some screws. Because this is a plywood cabinet, the cabinet itself isn't really going to move, so I'm not super concerned about not putting any sort of movement slots in the base. And then I could flip this upside down and start working on the inner parts of the cabinet. I was working on a laser engraving project at the same time, and I was kind of using this cabinet as storage for the pieces, hence all the stuff falling out of it. But you could see the sister project next to it. I made a video of that as well. Now for the doors, she wanted them flat faced, so they're not going to be any sort of stylized routing or anything like that to it. They're not even shaker style doors, which is what I usually do, flat faces. So in doing that, I'm going to be using plywood, and what I like to do is put a hardwood frame around the edge. Plywood, especially the taller door, is not going to be perfectly flat. So putting a thicker frame around the edge will help keep everything flat, as well as hide the fact that it is plywood. These are my rough dimensions. This cabinet glued up pretty square, so all I did was account for the reveal, which is going to be a little over, it's about 3/32 of an inch I like to do on these cabinet-based projects. And I calculated the thickness of the poplar. You can pause on my measurements if you want to see more in depth how I do that. And then I cut my plywood pieces. So you can see they're substantially smaller than the opening. And like I said, because the cabinet was fairly square, I basically am making these sized to fit, so I shouldn't have to do a lot of adjustments. This is your first time doing inset style doors, or you don't feel comfortable with them, I highly recommend just making them slightly oversized, and you could trim everything to fit. So I'm going to be joining the outside of these pieces with splines. I did this with the first cabinet base project as well. Just find it to be a fairly easy, solid joinery method. So because the material I'm using isn't exactly a quarter, it's like 3/32, I'm just going to be cutting this with a regular blade. You can see I marked where I needed it to be. You mount the fence slightly off center, and you can see you can flip it around, and that will give me a perfectly centered groove. I have my tall fence in place because the best way to make this accurate is to cut your splines and your grooves at the same time. So you can see I'm cutting all my plywood pieces at the same time as that poplar frame, so everything will be square. Obviously you're sending these things through quite a bit because you're doing all 4 sides and then flipping them, but honestly it's not that much extra work to do it that way. When I'm using 1/4 inch ply, which I didn't have in the shop and I like to utilize scrap, I put a 1/4 inch dado stack in there and cut the groove all at once. But because this was an odd size spline, that's why I decided to cut it with the offset technique. And then the splines, I'll put the short edges in place, measure for the long edges, and that is how the splines fit in that groove. And then I can just go or work my way around, cut miters for that outer frame. With miters, you can measure and cut all your pieces at once. I find it more accurate to mock this up, make marks, and work my way around the frame. So I'll cut my 45s on 2 long pieces. I'll get one corner set in place, and then I'll go through and mark this edge and then work my way around. So I'm referencing off of that solid corner to get accurate marks. You can see I could cut that piece, set it in place, and then work my way around all sides. Probably a little bit longer of a process, but like I said, it leads to highly accurate results. And like I said, you don't want to go about and not worry about making things tight and clean, but this is a paint grade project, so if your miters are not perfect, this is a type of project. Paint grade is going to be nice for beginners, especially because while you don't want to make mistakes, like I said, if you do make mistakes, it's much easier to cover them up if something is going to be paint grade. And then all of those splines get glued into place, and then that outer edge gets glued in as well. I'll put a couple brads in there to tack everything in place, but pretty simple process. This is obviously the smaller door, to the exact same process on all of the doors. The bigger door, like I said, these have 3/4 inch frame, just using some sawdust to clean up some of that glue, and then the next day I could come in and sand it. The larger door I went with an inch frame around that whole outside. So then these are the smaller doors mocked in place with inset hinges. You need some sort of backer there, otherwise they'll actually extend into the frame. These will have shelves in them, which will stop the doors from doing that, but until that happens, I just have a piece of metal there. Amazon actually originally sent me the wrong hinges. I like to order these online because they don't sell Blum in the stores by where I live. Unfortunately, this is more than once I've gotten the wrong hinges. You can see the inset hinges have that large crank, or overlay hinges don't have that. So luckily I had some, the other cabinet I'm working on, I could kind of pilfer the hinges temporarily from there and mock this stuff up. These will not come with instructions, at least most of them don't. You'll have to find them online, but the offsets are going to be about a little over 1 inch, and I just mock them in place, make my marks, and then I go from there. You can see this cabinet was pretty square, and like I said, I made this just to fit inside, but there's always going to be little undulations in the pieces. So what I did, like I said, I made this to fit the cabinet. I mocked it up on its hinges, I put it in place. That top side was where it was hitting, so I marked how much I needed to remove just based off eye. Took a couple passes with the plane to trim that down, and I'll put it back in place. If your frame carcass is not square, this is going to be a much longer, painstaking process, but like I said, mine was pretty square. My doors glued up square, so just had a little bit to remove off the top. I'm also going to remove just a little bit off of the side. You can see 1 or 2 passes with the plane. Keep mocking it in place, checking that reveal, making sure it's perfect, and then making sure everything's set. So with all these hinges, like I said, the mounting instructions are going to be a little different. I had just done inset hinges, so that I had the numbers fresh in my head, but a lot of times it's easier to just go to the website. Blum will have instructions for how to do it, and you could calculate all your offsets. Like I said, these cabinets are going to have shelves. I just used some scrap pegboard in order to drill those mounting holes. This one shelf this one side has 1, the other side has 2, so this was pretty easy. I cut the shelves a little shy in width and depth because I'm going to be putting edge banding on them. And then just to go through and clean this up, this 1/2 inch backer, because she wanted this flange in the back, will have exposed ply. You can cover this with edge banding, but because it's 1/2 inch, I've covered 1/2 inch with 3/4 inch edge banding, but a little more durable on that top side edge. I just ripped some 1/2 inch poplar and put a thin veneer on top. And then all the shelving also is going to get this iron-on edge banding. It's a very boring process, but I pretty much do that on all 4 sides. I patched and puttied this and then primed it, and then I'm going to go through and once you prime it, the water, I'm using a water-based primer on this, will raise the grain. So I just, instead of sanding beforehand, I basically like to put the primer on with the patch. Once that primer dries, it'll raise the grain, and I could sand everything down and then put the final finish on there. So I'm obviously spraying all of this. The spray just gives it a nice finish. It's a little bit of a pain to spray stuff like this in my shop just because of all of the dust. But these smaller pieces, it's actually pretty doable. The color was obviously picked by the client, but it was actually a color I had in the shop. It was close enough to what she wanted, so that was nice. I got to use up some paint from an old project. Once everything was pretty much dry, I could reassemble it. This is not completely done, but it's done enough for this video. See, I could put the shelves in, and then I had to realign all the hinges because, like I said earlier, Amazon sent me the wrong ones, so I was using some spares I had that not all of them were soft close, so I had to reorder them. So that means all the hinges were out of alignment. Could make my adjustments. There's probably going to be some fine tuning still left to do once everything's said and done. And the handles she's ordering, and I'll probably end up just installing those on site, so hence the blue tape. But that's pretty much it. Like I said, it's going to be a bench, probably shoes and a book bag are going to be put in that tall cabinet. And then the reason this isn't done is because she wants a glazing, antique glaze on top of it. I'm not a lover of applying or the look of faux finish, but it's not my piece of furniture. So I'm not planning on filming that. This is pretty much going to be it for this, because faux finish is one of those things where you kind of have to figure out how they want it to look versus there's many ways to apply it. It could be a little bit of a pain, so it's a little bit of a process of trial and error.